Selena strode between the trees. Okay, you're good.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to my fellow Patriots to our next version of, or next session, excuse me, of our Patriot Academy. I am Judge Michael Warren, host of Patriot Lessons, American History and Civics podcast, and co-creator of Patriot Week. We are very excited that you're joining us for our second annual and first virtual Patriot Academy. The great English author of 1984, An Animal Farm, reflected that the most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their understanding of their history. That's George Orwell. Well, Patriot Week and this Patriot Academy are fighting against any such efforts to obliterate our history or distort it. Patriot Week renews America's spirit by deepening the appreciation of the first principles, founding fathers, and other great patriots, vital documents and speeches, and flags that make America the greatest nation in world history. Many of our current holidays have become overly commercialized or have lost their deeper meaning. We need to reinvigorate our appreciation and understanding of America's spirit. Anchored by the key dates of September 11th, the anniversary of the terrorist attacks, and September 17th, Constitution Day, that's the anniversary of the signing of the Constitution by our founding fathers, the schedule for each day has a separate focus. Patriot Week started in 2009 when my then 10-year-old daughter, Leah, pounded on the table at a lunch and demanded a new celebration. Patriot Week has been recognized by the US Senate in a unanimous resolution, as well as by over 15 states with official gubernatorial and legislative proclamations and resolutions. Scores of K through 12 schools, public, charter, private, and home, universities, law schools, student groups, community organizations like Rotaries and Kiwanuses and senior centers and religious groups and others, cities, counties, courts, law firms, businesses, senior living communities, libraries, hospitals, historical groups, private homes, public officials, and others have engaged in a wide range of grassroots activities, including panel discussions, speakers, lesson plans, festivals, parades, picnics, commemorations, and even gubernatorial debate. Today, we are discussing the themes of September 14th. On 9/14, we commemorate the indispensable first principle of equality, gender. The groundbreaking leaders of gender equality, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the Seneca Falls Resolution, and the 19th Amendment, as well as the suffragette flag, which is behind me and we'll talk about later. We will begin by addressing the first principle of equality, gender equality. America was unique in the course of human history because when we declared independence, we did so in defense of certain founding beliefs, what we call first principles. The founders' political philosophy holds that adherence to certain first principles is a prerequisite to a free and just government. Each first principle is an indispensable cornerstone of the American Republic, and each must be well understood to secure our freedoms and continue our success on our grand experiment in self-government. And the core of these beliefs are laid out in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that when any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to establish new government, laying its foundation, such principles, and organizing its power such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. From those eloquent sentences, we can identify 6 first principles: the rule of law, unalienable rights, the social compact, equality, limited government, and the right to alter or abolish an oppressive government, that's revolution. Throughout the Academy, we will be discussing each of these in turn. Now, we have two in connection with equality, because that's been such a struggle for America. We felt it deserved 2 days, so we have one dedicated to gender and one dedicated to race. The Founding Fathers recognized as a self-evident truth that all men are created equal. The founders embraced the Judeo-Christian understanding of the Creator, an understanding that the Creator created all individuals, that each person arises from his handiwork, and that every person embodies his blessing. Regardless of physical or mental differences between individuals, and despite disparities in wealth or station, each individual is part of his creation and is equally precious in his eyes. Each person has dignity before God, and no person is elevated above his fellow man. Most important, each is loved equally by the Creator, and each is judged by his or her own deeds and intentions. Thus, putting aside the theological briar patch of predestination, each has an equal opportunity to obtain redemption from sin or damnation, and each chooses his or her own path. While this first principle originally arose from a belief in the nature of the Creator, the laws of nature lead many to the same conclusion. Undoubtedly, human evolution and nature have created subtle, or sometimes not so subtle, differences in each person, yet nature itself grants each individual the right to pursue his or her needs and desires. To compete in the state of nature, each person possesses the same opportunity, the same right embedded in his or her own very nature, to maintain his or her survival and to pursue happiness. If the beasts of nature are equally free to engage in a struggle for survival, without nature's God imposing capricious restrictions on their actions, then men are entitled to no less. More precisely, in a state of nature, all individuals are equal, not because of their capabilities, in which case all people are unequal, because everybody has different capabilities, but because they are entitled to at least plan, desire, and attempt to undertake the same actions as all others. Inevitably, the results will differ, but the ability to pursue like goals is not denied by nature. Likewise, the state of nature dictates that all persons are entitled to nurture their families, to establish and defend a home, and secure their rights. Even in England, the modern birthplace of the rule of law, the law continued to bolster and elevate the nobility. Likewise, in 1776, the French were over a decade away from overthrowing a regime that divided the society into 3 estates, with the first and the second, that being the clergy and the nobility, possessing oppressive powers embodied in law. The caste system defined India, and similar divisions were inherent in other great powers. Modern history is also replete with such societies. South Africa, during apartheid, segregated society by race. The Soviet Union divided society among classes and ethnic groups and creed and party, and Nazi Germany committed genocide in the pursuit of Aryan superiority. Whether based on class or caste or religion, race, tribe, ethnic group, economic status, language, party membership, eugenics, or otherwise, governments throughout most of world history have maintained divisions among individuals and groups of individuals. These divisions were often woven into the fundamental law of society. Such governments were based on the proposition that all men were not created equal. From its very founding, however, America aspired to embody the first principle that all men are created equal. Not only did the Declaration of Independence affirm this principle, so did the state constitutions that were drafted and ratified during the Declaration of Independence and following the Declaration of Independence and the Revolution. Those constitutions consistently state in some form that all men are by nature equally free and independent. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln reaffirmed this founding principle in the Gettysburg Address when he explained that the nation was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. This equality of each individual, however, is one of rights and opportunity, not results. In other words, as the 14th Amendment states, each individual is entitled to equal protection of the laws. This equal protection does not require that the government attempt to equalize the social status or wealth or property of individuals. By embracing the first principle of equality, the Founding Fathers once again rejected the deliberately inequitable regimes dominating the globe in their time. Inequality codified in the law was a cornerstone of government throughout world history. Hereditary, nobility, and other special classes were almost universally granted special privileges unknown to the common person. Equality before the law simply requires that each individual, irrespective of race, color, creed, nationality, wealth, social status, religion, and similar characteristics be treated equally by the government. Wealthy white Lutheran men, therefore, should be subject to the same treatment under the law as poor Muslim women and vice versa. Combined with the rule of law, this first principle requires that each person be treated equally under the law and that the equal protection of all the laws be afforded to all. Still, we know in 1776 that women were excluded from the first principles of a free and just government. From the Revolution to the early 20th century, no women possessed substantial political rights, and married women possessed no substantial economic rights. That gender inequality could exist in a land founded on the first principles of equality, protection of unalienable rights, and the social compact presented an inevitable conflict. It would take a momentous struggle culminating in the ratification of the 19th Amendment to at least give women just the right to vote. Many more decades would pass before women would approach true equality under the law. Even now, America is not entirely free from its legacy of gender inequality. The idea of equality, however, needed real people to bring it to life. And considering that gender equality considered it was a laughable proposition at our founding, it took real people of courage to make us start to live up to our first principles. Two of those leaders are Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. To discuss them will be Christina Bilios, a real patriot and tremendous contributor to Patriot Week. I'm going to let her introduce herself and then go forward in connection with the two patriots. Christina, the floor is yours.
Good evening, Judge Warren. Thank you so much for having me be on the presentation today. I do believe it was Karen Wentz who was speaking about these wonderful patriots, and I would be covering the Seneca Falls documentation and the 19th Amendment.
And I totally misspoke. Karen Wentz, a board member of Patriot Week Foundation, will be presenting in connection with the two patriots that I just mentioned. Sorry about that, Christina. Way to fill in for me. And Christina, we'll come back to you. Karen, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome back. I thought it was interesting that I got to share on Friday about our patriots that had the revolution against Britain. And now I get to share about some wonderful women that really had a revolution for women's rights. So I'm going to screen share with you all. All right. So at this time, you guys should see a screen that says Patriots Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony.
We can see it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Judge. Okay, so Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Most well known for being one of the early leaders of the women's rights movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was an author, lecturer, and chief philosopher of the women's rights and suffrage movements. In fact, she wrote the Declaration of Sentiments, which was a powerful call to arms for female equality, formulated the agenda for women's rights, and was the president of the National Women's Suffrage Association for nearly 20 years. She was born on November 12, 1815 in New York. Her father was a lawyer, and he wasn't shy about expressing the fact that he was a bit disappointed that Elizabeth was a girl and not another son. But maybe this poor fathering played a role in Elizabeth's drive to excel in education in areas that were primarily dominated by men. She received her formal education at Johnson Academy and at Emma Willard's Troy Female Seminary in New York. And Elizabeth took advantage of her father's legal background, and she educated herself not only by just speaking with her father, but listening in on his conversations with his colleagues and guests. Stanton married an abolitionist lecturer, Henry Stanton. Her natural drive kind of drove her to join her husband in becoming active in the anti-slavery movement. And she actually traveled, She actually traveled with him to London, where she tried to attend the World's Anti-Slavery Convention, but strangely enough, oddly enough, she could not attend because she was a woman. And instead, she joined with other women who objected to their exclusion from this assembly. As fate would have it, during this time, she met Lucretia Mott, who was a fellow woman who was very upset that she couldn't be a part of these proceedings. And so, of course, the two women became fast friends, and they vowed to call a women's rights convention when they returned home. However, upon returning home, Stanton and her husband had 7 children. And while her husband studied and practiced law, she raised those children. But 8 years after returning home, she was true to her word. And in 1848, she and Mott held the first women's rights convention at Seneca Falls in New York. And Stanton authored the Declaration of Sentiments, which expanded on the Declaration of Independence by adding the word woman or women throughout the document. This pivotal document called for social and legal changes to evaluate women's place in society and listed 18 grievances, from the inability to control their wages and poverty, or to the difficulty in gaining custody and divorce and the lack of the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony was another pioneer woman in the women's suffrage movement. Anthony's work helped pave the way for the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, giving women the right to vote in 1920. In fact, the 19th Amendment was known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment to honor the work she did on behalf of women's rights. She was a champion of temperance, abolition, the right of labor, and equal pay for equal work. She was born on February 15, 1820 in Massachusetts. She was a daughter of a cotton mill owner and a farmer. Her mother came from a family that fought in the American Revolution and served in the Massachusetts state government. So Susan grew up in a politically active home where her family was very active in working to end slavery. She had 7 brothers and sisters, and many of them became activists for justice and emancipation of slaves. And when she and her family moved to Rochester, New York in 1845, the Anthony's social circle included anti-slavery activists and escaped slave Frederick Douglass, who would actually later join Anthony in the fight for women's rights. When Susan B. Anthony was denied a chance to speak at a convention because of her gender, she was inspired to shift her focus to the fight for women's rights. She realized that no one would take women in politics seriously unless they had the right to vote. And she wrote, "There will never be complete equality until women themselves help to make laws and elect lawmakers." So the team came together in 1851 when the two women met, and they quickly became fast friends, and they worked together to draft speeches, articles, and books. When Stanton wasn't able to travel due to the demands of raising her 7 children, she would author speeches that Anthony would deliver. However, Elizabeth was also an incredible speaker as well. Her speeches addressed topics such as maternity, child rearing, divorce law, married women's property rights, and presidential campaigns as well. Both women were very involved in the Civil War efforts and joined together to advocate for the 13th Amendment, which of course ended slavery. And both women stood together and opposed the 14th and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution because while it gave voting rights to Black men, it did not extend that same right to women. Their strong stance led to a rift between other women's suffragists and prompted Stanton and Anthony to instead found the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1869. Around the same time, the women got together and produced a weekly publication called The Revolution, and within it, they wrote articles that lobbied for women's rights under the American Equal Rights Association. As the National Women's Suffrage Association president, Stanton was an outspoken social and political commentator and debated the major political and legal questions of the day. The two major women's suffrage groups reunited again in 1890 and the National American Women's Suffrage Association. By 1880, Stanton was 65 years old, and instead of traveling and speaking, she focused more on writing. And so she wrote 3 volumes of the history of women's suffrage. She also published a woman's Bible in which she voiced her belief in a secular state. She also wrote an autobiography called 80 Years and More. And it was a great, of course, about her life. Susan was a great strategist. Her discipline, energy, and ability to organize made her a strong, successful leader. Anthony lectured to raise money for publishing their newspaper and also supporting the suffrage movement. And she was so tireless in her efforts, she took matters into her own hands in 1872 when she, in fact, voted illegally in a presidential election. She was arrested, and she was tried, and she she was unable to fight those charges, and she ended up receiving a $100 fine. However, she never paid said $100 fine. Elizabeth died in October 1902 in New York at the age of 81, 18 years before the women gained their right to vote. Elizabeth had a gift. She had a gift not only for writing, but really for speaking, and the courage that drove her to speak out against women's rights. Anthony died on March 13th, 1906 at the age of 86. She, in fact, never married, never had any kids, and instead devoted her life to the cause of women's equality. She once said that she wished to live another century and see the fruition of all the work for women. She died not having the right to vote, and it wasn't until 1920, 14 years after her death, that the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was passed. However, the U.S. Treasury Department put Anthony's portrait on the $1 coin, which I'm sure we've all have seen, and that was in 1979, and that made her the first woman to be actually pictured on money and currency. Both of these women provide a profound and humbling example of what it looks like to devote one's life to a cause that they themselves never got to experience and enjoy. We should all be so committed to our individual challenges in life. Thank you so much.
Give me 1 second. I want to thank Karen for that fabulous, spectacular rendition of the two patriots. What an amazing life that they had, such a great partnership. And unfortunately, they never got to see the fruits of their efforts come true while they were alive. But I have no doubt that they're up there and they rejoiced. As we're going to find out, this is the centennial of the fruition of their efforts, in that the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, was approved and it became effective 100 years ago this year. And now we will bring on Christina Bilowis, who I introduced earlier. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Judge. We are assembled to protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed, to declare our right to be free as man is free, to be represented in the government which we are taxed to support, to have such disgraceful laws as give man the power to chastise and imprison his wife, to take the wages which she earns, the property which she inherits, and in case of separation, the children of her love. These were words of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and she said these at the beginning of a speech at the Seneca Falls Convention. The Seneca Falls Convention was the first women's rights convention in the United States. It was held in July of 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, and the meeting launched the women's suffragette movement, which more than 7 decades later ensured women the right to vote. Originally, this was known as the Women's Rights Convention, and it fought for social, civil, and religious rights of women. The meeting was held from July 19th to July 20th of 1848 at the Wesleyan Chapel. It received scarce publicity, with about 300 people who were mainly residents showed up. On the first day, only women were allowed to attend, but on the second day, men also attended as well. The convention proceeded to discuss resolutions on women's rights. Generally, all passed unanimously except for the 9th resolution, which demanded the right for women to vote. Stanton and abolitionist Frederick Douglass gave impassioned speeches in its defense before it barely passed. Now, as Karen spoke of, she spoke in detail about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and some of the other original suffragettes. And some of the original suffragettes were the original organizers of this convention. And it also called for an end to slavery and racial discrimination. These leading organizers were Elizabeth Cady Stanton, her friend Lucretia Mott, Mary Emma McClintock, Martha Coffin Wright, and Jane Hunt. And Stanton and Mott first met in London in 1840 when they were attending, as we learned, the World Anti-Slavery Convention with their husbands. And when that convention excluded women delegates solely based on their sex, the pair resolved to hold a women's right convention. Interestingly enough, a fact that I just learned was that Susan B. Anthony was not actually attending the Seneca Falls Convention, but as we learned that she worked closely with Elizabeth Stanton and carried on her work throughout the years. Back in the United States at this time, women rights reformers had already begun contending for women's rights to speak on moral and political issues, which dated back to the 1830s. Around that same time in New York, where Stanton lived, legal reformers had been discussing equality and challenging state laws prohibiting married women from owning property. And by 1848, equal rights for women was a divisive issue. In July of 48, Stanton, who was frustrated with her role at staying at home and raising children, convinced Mott, White, and McClintock to help organize the Seneca Falls Convention and write its main manifesto, which is known as the Declaration of Sentiments. And together, these 5 women drafted a notice to announce a convention to discuss the social, civic, and religious conditions and rights of women. The Declaration of Sentiments was the manifesto that described women's grievances and demands. It was written primarily by Stanton and called on women to fight for their constitutionally guaranteed rights to equality as U.S. citizens. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal, the document stated. It was inspired by the Declaration of Independence, and this Declaration of Sentiments asserted women's equality in politics, religion, family, morals, education, and jobs. The Declaration began with the 19 abuses that were destined to destroy a woman's confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, and to make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life. And because women did not have the right to vote, a right given to the most ignorant and degraded men, they were forced to submit to laws to which they did not consent. Women were denied and educated and issued an inferior role in the church. And moreover, women were required to be obedient to their husbands, that prevented them from owning property, including their own wages that they earned, and technically belonged to their husbands. And they received unequal rights upon divorce. And in light of these abuses, the Declaration called on women to, quote, throw off such government, end quote. Now, in resolution came a list of 11 proposals, which demanded women to be regarded as man's equal. The resolution called on Americans to regard any laws that placed women in an inferior position to men as having no force or authority. And they resolved to have women to have equal rights within the church and equal access to jobs. The 9th resolution, which was the most controversial, as it called women to secure themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise, which dealt with the right to vote. And although its passage led many women's right proponents to withdraw their support, the 9th resolution went on to become the cornerstone of the women's suffragette movement. As you can imagine, there were strong reactions to the Seneca Falls Convention in New York and across the United States. Newspapers covered the convention both in support and against its objectives. And the fight for women's rights continued. 2 weeks later, on August 2nd, 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention reconvened at the First Unitarian Church of Rochester, New York, to reaffirm the movement's goals with a larger audience. In the following years, the convention's leaders continued to campaign for women's rights at state and nationwide events. Reformers frequently refer to the Declaration of Sentiments as they campaigned for women's rights. And in between 1848 and 1862, the participants of the convention used the Declaration of Sentiments to employ agents, circulate tracts, petition the state and national legislators, and endeavor to enlist the pulpit and the press on their behalf. And then finally, after 72 years of organized struggle, all American women finally achieved the same rights as men at the polling booth, when in 1920, women won the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Now, segueing into the 19th Amendment, we know that it guarantees American women the right to vote. But achieving this milestone required a lengthy and difficult struggle. As we learned today, victory took decades of agitation, multiple proponents, and years of struggle. And beginning in the 19th century, women suffragette supporters lectured, wrote, marched, lobbied, and practiced civil disobedience to achieve what many Americans considered radical change. Women faced imprisonment and struggled with imprisonment for fighting for these rights. Between 1878, when the amendment was first introduced in Congress, and 1920, when it was ratified, champions of voting rights for women worked tirelessly. but their strategies varied. And just taking a moment to appreciate that length of time between 1878 and 1920. Some tried to pass suffragette acts in each state. 9 Western states adopted women's suffragette legislation by 1912, while others challenged male-only voting laws in the courts. More public tactics included parades, silent vigils, and hunger strikes. But supporters were often heckled, jailed, and sometimes physically abused. By 1916, most of the major suffragette organizations united behind the goal of a constitutional amendment. When New York adopted women's suffrage in 1917, President Wilson changed his position and supported the amendment in 1918. And when this occurred, the political balance finally began to shift. On May 21st, 1919, the House of Representatives passed the amendment, and 2 weeks later, the Senate followed. However, it would not be until 1920 when Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the amendment on August 18, 1920, the amendment was finally adopted. While decades of struggle to include African Americans and other minority women in the promise of voting rights remained, the face of the American electorate had changed forever when women were finally granted the right to vote. Though it would take years later to achieve true equality, we celebrate this year the 100 years of the 19th Amendment and its passage. Thank you very much.
Christina, that was fabulous. What an inspiring discussion about those 2 documents and how monumental they were. And I might have one little amendment. I think we still have some ways to go in connection with gender equality. So I'm sure you didn't mean to say anything otherwise. But by putting out the pole star of gender equality, you're moving the country forward to more fulfilling the first principle of equality. A couple of things as we're going to segue into the last segment here. For those of you that may have missed prior sessions of the Patriot Academy or might not be able to make the next couple, we are posting them online at patriotweek.org under our education tab, and all the sessions up to today have been uploaded. So if you were only able to see part of it or want to go back or haven't been able to catch them, please do so. That's why they're there. I think you'll find them quite fascinating. Also, if you're interested in submitting a question, we have the chat function in this Zoom call, and I'm confident we'll have time to take some questions if you're interested. If you put your cursor to the bottom of the Zoom screen, you'll see kind of in the middle of the bottom a little chat bubble, and that's where you can type in a question. And assuming it's an appropriate question on this topic, I can pitch it to one of the others, or I can try to answer it. We will end hard at 8 o'clock no matter what, but if you have any questions you'd like to present, that's the way to do it. We certainly welcome those. Patriot Week board member John Wilson was scheduled to discuss the suffragette flag, and he's done the flags so far in our Patriot Academy. But if you've been watching the last couple, he's been struggling with some a cough, and he's really under the weather today. So I'm pinch hitting for him, and I appreciate the fact that you have to listen to me drone on again. Hopefully I'll do a good enough job for John. As you can see, so we're going to be discussing the suffragette flag, and that's this flag here. And it has a number of distinguishing characteristics that you might not expect in connection with a flag that you would see in American history. So the first thing is it has these colors that are very unusual. You know, most flags have red, white, and blue. If you've been watching prior episodes, or excuse me, sessions of the Patriot Academy, you saw the Bennington flag with the big 76 in the corner, red, white, and blue, blue Union, red and white stripes. If you saw, we talked about the Betsy Ross flag. Everybody knows that vase is very similar to the 76 flag, except it has in the Union, it has 13 stars in a circle. And there also was the current American flag, which obviously is red, white, and blue. This is the only color that we normally associate with our American flags is the white. And so I want to go through why it's gold and white and purple. Gold was a color that was commonly used by all the US suffragette organizations. So that was kind of a unifying color They chose to use that color because they thought it represented, and I'll talk in a second exactly what, but they thought it represented the ideals of the suffragette movement. White also became very prominent, and you will see that in pictures of suffragettes and their rallies, and their protests and their speeches. Often they're wearing straight white, and it became a very significant color associated with the suffragette movement. And you may remember that when the House of Representatives was in session for President Trump's State of the Union speech, there was a big conglomerate of women in white, and they were doing that to commemorate the centennial of women's suffrage. So that tradition has continued. The purple, white, and gold combination, though, was really only used by the National Women's Party in the United States. So there was a few different suffragette organizations. They ended up being the major one near the drive to have final ratification, as Christina pointed out. And so that's the one that is most associated with getting it over the goal line, so to speak, and this flag became very prominent in that drive. The organization described the meaning of these colors in a newsletter that was published on December 6th of 1913. And it stated, purple is the color of loyalty, constancy to purpose, unswerving steadfastness to a cause. White is the emblem of purity, symbolizes the quality of purpose and of our purpose. And then gold is the color of light and life. And it is as the torch that guides our purpose, pure and unswerving. So they knew what they were doing. They picked those three colors for a reason. The flag was used, as I mentioned before, in a variety of parades and marches and protests. And perhaps the most famous nonviolent protest that they used the flag in was when the suffragettes stood in front of the White House holding the flags and banners. Was some of the pictures you saw with Karen Wentz, banners like that, which quoted President Wilson's own speeches about democracy and demanding that women be included in that democracy. They would remain there in shifts for months, regardless of the weather, and they were dubbed the Silent Sentinels. This was very controversial. Having protests at the White House was not something that anybody ever did before. And there were a number of men and women that became enraged and livid by the protest. And then it got worse because the United States declared war against Germany and entered the Great War. That's World War I to us. And most expected that the suffragettes would stop their protesting because they needed, it was unheard of to protest, putting aside the Civil War, which is a whole different thing, to protest a president in the middle of a war. And the suffragists said, no, we're still going to do it. So they persevered. And what happened was they got, it wasn't like there were a lot of people that were excited about this. Crowds gathered around the protesters. Children spit at them. Men physically attacked them. And the police, they stood by and watched. Actually, the police arrested women for obstructing traffic. That led to hunger strikes and all kinds of other protests that really backlashed against the roughhousing that the women were subjected to, and became a very, very important change that eventually changed the politics, in which Woodrow Wilson then endorsed women's suffrage, ironically enough, as a war measure. As the 19th Amendment was being considered for ratification, every time a state would adopt and ratify the 19th Amendment, because they needed 36, they would sew a star into the flag. And so sometimes, so it's very interesting because you'll see some flags that just have 1 star, 2 stars, a few stars. This one represents when it's all done. And many states had defeated the amendment, but eventually they got the 36. And when they got the news that the struggle was over, it was Tennessee that put them over the goal line. Suffragette leader at the time, Alice Paul, unfurled a humongous flag, and they put it over the National Women's Party's headquarters in Washington, D.C., and that represented the victory of women's suffrage. So this is a flag that has a lot of history to it. It was used for many, many years. It was proudly displayed by the women, and not just women, the men that supported it as well. They use it as a counting technique, as a symbol of their unity and perseverance and their purity. And it really was a rallying symbol for the suffragette movement. And unfortunately, I've seen some revival of it in the last year or so because of the centennial, but basically it was forgotten. When Patriot Week was started back in 2009, my daughter Leah and I kind of went through all the different flags, because she suggested that flags would be a great way to engage kids. Originally, she said, let's have fireworks. I said, Leah, you know, fireworks, they're expensive. You got to go outside. It's kind of taken. She said, oh yeah, you're right, Dad. Let's have flags. And I think this is a great example of a flag that can get people excited and interested in the history, and is truly symbolic of the struggle, and was really almost totally forgotten. So it's the little revival, and hopefully it will stick around in people's minds. But Patriot Week is here to make sure that it stays alive as a symbol of equality for all people in the country. This is a flag that has a great storied history. It should not simply gather dust in the history books, and it shows the power of a symbol to move a nation. I'm going to see if we have any questions. We do. So we have from David, it took over 70, I'm saying this out loud, so hopefully it's a good question. It took over 70 years before women received the right to vote when the 19th Amendment was ratified. There must have been some very aggressive opposition to women's suffrage if it took that long. What were the main objections to women's suffrage, and were there a few main arguments against it? So that's a great question, David, and there was a vociferous opposition to the adoption of the 19th Amendment. And it happened for, the arguments that were presented were broad and diverse, and I want to emphasize it wasn't just men that had these arguments, it was also women. The first thing was that in the whole course of human history, women were not assumed to have political rights at all. They weren't working, they weren't workers, they didn't own businesses, they didn't engage in professions. It was very, very rare for a woman to rise above the inherent bias. So this is just not an American issue. In fact, America was a true leader in this struggle. It was a worldwide issue. And in one sense, in many senses, America was on the cutting edge of changing people's view of women and their capacity, because we had put in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and laid out those first principles. And then the suffragettes could point to that and say, am I not a person? Why don't I have inalienable rights? I'm born, I'm a child of God. We have a social compact, I'm supposed to be part of it. Why aren't I part of equality? So it really instigated a fundamental change in mindset. Now that took, as you point out, decades and decades to come to fruition. But it was very, very unique. Really, there was no clamor at 1776. There were a few exceptions. I'll point one out in just a second. But no one expected women to have any kind of political or economic power of any material means. So the opposition that took effect was tradition and custom. Secondly, that women's place was in a home, that they were the homemaker, that they were busy for that they had a disposition that was too frail and fragile to get involved in the hard-hitting, bustling, fighting, combat, political realm, that they just didn't have the character. Also, that a man and a husband would more fairly represent the interests of the family. So that women didn't need to have that vote. That it would make women, it would empower them to do things like get jobs and to marry out of wedlock. And there was what we call parade of horribles that they listed. So there was quite a contention about this, anti, and when women, and I said I'd talk about some exceptions at the beginning. When the idea of women's suffrage first arose, it was laughable because the society was so ingrained in the patriarchy. And the example I want to point out too is Abigail Adams. Now, Abigail Adams was John Adams' wife, and she was a very smart person. They were really kind of partners. She was always behind the scenes helping John with his political efforts. He would consult with her all the time. She was real instrumental in his development as leadership. And when they declared independence, she wrote him a letter because they were separated. They wrote a lot of love letters. They were very passionate. It's hard to believe if you look at John Adams, he was a passionate lover, but he was. And he wrote, he said, we've declared independence, all this. And so she responded and said, don't forget the ladies. When you're creating new codes of government and law for America, don't forget the women, because your idea of equality applies to us as well. And his response was very dismissive. He said, I can only laugh at this. Obviously, men are too smart to give up our power for women. We know if women get power that they will control everything. And so we need to hold on to what we can. And we know that you're the masters behind the scenes anyway. So we can't possibly give you the vote. And that was kind of and I'm a huge John Adams fan, but not there, right? There was this real paradigm of women don't need it, shouldn't have it, can't exercise it well. There's all kinds of sub-arguments, but that's kind of the broad overview. If any of the other speakers want to chime in, they're certainly welcome to. We do have a second question, which I wanted to touch base, which is, what is the biggest obstacle to the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment? It was very simple. I should take a step back. So the Equal Rights Amendment was something that was suggested by Alice Paul and her allies after the 19th Amendment was adopted. And there was a big movement. It got kind of sidetracked, and then eventually many states signed on. The amendment itself required that the ratification occur within 7 years, and they didn't make it in the 7 years, and they extended it, and there's some controversy about whether or not they can extend it, and then now there's another state that's thinking about doing it, but the years have all lapsed, but can they really bind the years? So it's an interesting legal constitutional question. But with regard to the obstacle, there was a real pushback as the amendment was gaining steam, because it was led by women. Phyllis Schlafly was the main person that led the movement. And there were lots of other people, but basically said, men and women really do have differences. And so the law needs to have some flexibility to be able to accommodate that. Otherwise, you're going to be having major social upheaval that we don't expect, and kind of unintended consequences. And one of the things that they said, for example, was that women would serve in combat. They'd be subject to the draft. That might not be so controversial now, but back when this amendment was rolling through, we had Vietnam. There were other conflicts, and they did not want, it was kind of unfathomable that we would be sending women into combat and coming back in body bags. So that was part of it. There was also arguments about what it would require employers to do, that there would, we've had this big controversy about bathrooms. That was argued. Right now, the United States Supreme Court's, getting kind of in the weeds here, but I think it's important to understand. We have what they call a constitutional test in connection with the government action that might infringe on equal rights. The highest level is called strict scrutiny. And for example, if the government discriminates against people based on their race, then the government's interest must be compelling, and the means of the government must be narrowly drawn. That's the test that the Supreme Court's adopted. We can fight about whether or not there should be such a test, because why doesn't equality just mean equality? But the government, through the Supreme Court, has adopted this test. So theoretically, and I'll give you an example, race-based admissions in universities, if done very carefully to support the interest of creating diversity in a learning community, affirmative action or a certain kind of, not quotas, but kind of using that as criterion, that has survived Supreme Court challenge. So, but it's very rare. Usually it says strict in theory, fatal in practice. So it's extremely rare for race-based discrimination to survive. But for gender discrimination, it's what we call intermediate scrutiny, and that just means it's an important state interest, and that it's and I'm forgetting the term, but basically roughly designed to make it. So it doesn't have to be narrow, the strictest and most narrow way to effectuate the interest. It just kind of has to be pretty good. So some government policies acknowledging the distinction between men and women have met that test. For example, you could have separate schools for boys and girls. As long as everything else is equal, you could divide them up. And there's some other areas like that. So there's some concern that if you were to change the test, if you were to constitutionalize the ERA, that would make everything, maybe that would I'll go to heightened scrutiny, the highest test, and you'd have all these kind of unintended social consequences. So I think that's a major concern. But the biggest challenge now is there's no, I don't know that any more states would adopt it. And if any states wanted to adopt it, whether or not it could even be effective, because this time limit that was already extended has lapsed. And so it would be a really interesting new novel constitutional question about whether or not it could be effective once we've gone past it. I hope that answered your question. I'll give another second or two for additional questions. I don't know if Karen or Christina wanted to jump in on either of the questions that I've already touched base on. Doesn't look like it. Looks like they're pretty satisfied. Fellow Patriots, I hope that you have enjoyed and learned something in this September 14th virtual Patriot Academy session. We still have some more because Patriot Week doesn't end to the 17th, so we've got 3 more sessions. As I mentioned earlier, we do have the ones that are already been recorded or up on our website, and we'll be loading those up as we go through the week. So don't forget to go back to patriotweek.org. We also have our fabulous Patriot Lessons American History and Civics podcast, where we jump into these issues in much greater detail. So for example, equality, we have a whole episode dedicated to equality, a whole episode dedicated to inalienable rights. And the equality one doesn't even touch gender, it's just the general concept of equality. If you're really interested and intrigued by these questions, we have a lot of resources on the website, not just the podcast, but we also have a Patriot Lessons TV show, which both Karen and Christina have contributed to over many years, and we appreciate all their hard work. We have lesson plans for students from elementary students all the way to college. We have daily celebrations, so if you're stuck in the pandemic and you want to figure out a way to participate other than watching the Academy, you can go to the daily celebrations, and you can do that with your friends and family. And we have a lot more of resources that you can use at patriotweek.org. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. You also might want to check out my book, America's Survival Guide, How to Stop, I'm trying to grab a copy of it now, How to Stop America's Impending Suicide by Reclaiming Our Founding First Principles in History. So a lot of the themes here are in the book. There's a whole chapter on gender equality, whole chapter on racial equality. Each of the first principles, there's some major information on. And you can find that at americasurvivalguide.com or Amazon or any other online retailer. We're really excited that you were able to join us this evening. We hope that you come back for the last 3 episodes of our Patriot Academy. And until then, God bless you and God bless America.